Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for attending today's webinar. Today we're going to talk about HAZWOPER training, Hazardous Waste Operator training, and whether or not it actually does affect your facility. It's a very important part of today's safety environment, and so we're going to go through that in some great detail today with our host, Paul Colangelo. Paul's going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to answer your questions. So keep those questions handy. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a little Q&A box. If you do have questions during the course of the webinar, please put those into the Q&A box, and we will answer those at the very end. One of the most common questions I get from folks is the copy of the presentation going to be available for us? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. At the end of the webinar, you'll get an email from us with some survey questions. Just fill that out. Respond back, let us know that you want a copy of the webinar, and I will get that out to you. Additionally, if you happen to miss part of the training, or if you want to share this with some of your coworkers, we also will have this video posted up on our website, up on Vimeo, and also up on YouTube. So we'll give you plenty of opportunity to take a look at it moving forward. So without further ado, I do want to introduce our presenter for today, Mr. Paul Colangelo. Paul?
Thank you very much, John, and I assume I'm coming in clearly, and if I'm not, I'm sure you'll let me know. Good morning, everyone, and good day, and I hope your day is going well from whatever area of the country you happen to be calling in on. As John mentioned, my name is Paul Colangelo. I am an environmental health and safety consultant. I've been in the industry coming up on about 30 years. And one of the areas that I specialize in is assisting companies in designing training programs and curriculums. And I can tell you far and away that when it comes to HAZWOPER, one of the OSHA standards, that tends to be a topic that creates a lot of confusion and a lot of questions. So one of the goals I have today is to just orientate you with the standard itself, and talk a little bit about some of the questions that commonly come up about training and how it actually applies to your organization. So without further ado, we're going to start this off. And first of all, a little bit of background and a little bit of basics. HAZWOPER, as John mentioned earlier, stands for Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response. It is a standard of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA. HAZWOPER actually was established in 1989. And even though HAZWOPER is a very robust standard, a lot of these subparts and standards that you see with OSHA are very cut and dry, fairly easy to understand. I would say that the HAZWOPER program, it's got a lot of moving pieces and parts to it. So it is very robust in its nature. But if I had to sum up what HAZWOPER is all about in one sentence, it would be the third bullet. It basically is to protect workers so that they may safely interact with hazardous substances. So again, if there's just kind of a general blanket statement that I would apply to HAZWOPER in general, that's basically it. And the reason why the word workers is highlighted is because what I'd like you to do throughout this presentation is understand that OSHA, they enforce employers and employees, not the general public, not the environment. That's other administration's job. So OSHA is strictly focused on how to protect the worker and how to enforce the employer on protecting that worker. So the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which came about in 1970 by Congress, it actually created OSHA. OSHA is a division of the Department of Labor. OSHA's mission is to ensure that employers provide their employees a safe and healthful working condition free from recognized hazards. That is basically the entire mission of OSHA in general. A lot of people get a little afraid when they hear OSHA. They think, well, that is the big brother out to enforce me. Don't get me wrong, OSHA certainly does lead with enforcement of its standards. But what a lot of people are not aware of is that OSHA has a lot of outreach into the industry to provide things like training and education assistance to employers. They certainly understand, especially when it comes to small and medium-sized employers that may be limited with their budgets and resources, they try to provide as much free assistance as they can. So one of the things I would encourage you to do, if you're not familiar with OSHA, is there is the OSHA website, www.osha.gov. A lot of great information that you can obtain from that website, including a lot of safety and health information on the HAZWOPER program in general. One thing I did want to point out that I told John before the presentation, I typically do not like to click on links during webinars. Don't know why. There's just this strange anomaly. Sometimes you click on a link and it goes to the website just fine, and it's very difficult to get back into the presentation. Being that you will be provided a copy of this presentation, all those links will be active when you get it, so please feel free to access all the hot links within the presentation. I also want to point out that many states do have OSHA programs as well. I believe to date, 28 states do have their own occupational safety and health programs. Many of them are almost identical or very similar to the federal OSHA regulations. Some of them do have their own takes on it, states like California and Oregon, Nevada. But for the most part, most of the states with their own OSHA programs are very similar or identical in nature to OSHA itself. When we talk about OSHA, one of the things you need to be aware of is that the standards that OSHA has in place, they are applicable to certain industries. The two most popular are going to be the 1910 regulations, 29 CFR, that stands for Code of Federal Regulations. So you're going to see references a lot throughout things like a HAZWOPER program to that. The general industry is known as 1910.120. That's where you're going to find the HAZWOPER standard located in the general industry. So the general industry regulations are 1910, but 1910.120 specifically references the HAZWOPER standard. In construction, those regulations are known as CFR 1926. Specifically, 1926.65 references the HAZWOPER standard for construction. I want to point out that both the general industry and construction HAZWOPER standard are identical. That a lot of people ask, is there any specific difference between general industry and construction? Those standards are identical in nature. You're just going to find them in those two separate standards, one general industry, one construction. The other confusion that comes about with HAZWOPER, a lot of people think that HAZWOPER is specifically an EPA program. I do want to point out that the Environmental Protection Agency also has their own HAZWOPER program, and that's the CFR that you can find it in, 40 CFR 311. But unlike OSHA, that mandates private sector employers, and some of the state program mandates public sector, the EPA is strictly for public sector workers. The program itself, the HAZWOPER program from the EPA, is also identical to OSHA's. So there's not going to be any language difference when you take a look at the standards between the EPA and OSHA. And I did tell you a minute ago that OSHA is specifically focused on employers and employees. The EPA, they are focused on more of the public and the ecology and the environment. So those are definitely two differentiators between OSHA and the EPA. Now, HAZWOPER program does affect multiple industries. Most of my work does occur in the construction industry, so I educate construction companies quite often on HAZWOPER program and affiliated HAZWOPER training. However, HAZWOPER also applies greatly to the general industry areas of manufacturing. It also specifically can focus on what they call TSD facilities, treatment, storage, and disposal. Those would be folks that specifically, work with, treat, respond to hazardous waste and substances. If you think about companies like Safety Clean, Waste Management Systems, those are those players in that market. It also applies to transportation companies, engineering, environmental services, and a whole lot more, but those are some of the major players in industries that are affected by HAZWOPER. Now, I explained a little bit about what I would call a blanket statement toward HAZWOPER that I shared with you in an earlier slide. But if we want to continue, if we want to build upon, the HAZWOPER program, and again, it's a very robust program. If you literally sat down with the HAZWOPER standard, for the first time, you'd be very overwhelmed by how large it is, by how many different components that are involved in that. But we're going to take a look at some of the major ones here. And one of the first things is HAZWOPER does specifically apply to emergency response activities. And it goes on to say where there is an uncontrolled release of a hazardous substance or where an uncontrolled release is likely. One of the things I hear quite often from companies that have either been told they need HAZWOPER training or you're sitting on the fence as to whether or not you feel that this standard applies to you. Most people immediately say, well, look, we don't work with hazardous waste and substances. We don't do that. That's not part of our operations. Well, just because it's not part of your operations, it does not mean that the standard doesn't apply to you. And that photo right there is a typical example of how HAZWOPER could suddenly come about on a job site. You've got a crew of construction workers and an excavator working out there, and they're digging in the earth. And then suddenly, they come across a large underground tank that's not supposed to be there. Nobody told them that, there were things like this under the ground. Well, without basic HAZWOPER training, there's one thing I've learned over the 30-year period about construction workers. They're very fearless and they're very curious. So suddenly you come upon a situation like that, and the next thing you know, you've got 25, 30 workers that are surrounding this, giant underground tank that may be filled with a component like hydrochloric acid that could either, explode and turn into a bomb at any minute, or release, hazardous vapors that could, take out, a crew of 25 people. So without that basic HAZWOPER training, that would immediately tell them, hey, time to shut down operations and time to call in, the proper hazardous material specialist to come and investigate what's going on. These are some of the things that HAZWOPER training does address in a very basic awareness way for, general workers. So just some of the things that, can come about and create a HAZWOPER situation. Any sort of a leak of hazardous substance from a storage tank or container, overturned rail cars, chemical fires, mechanical breaks down. Anytime that you're doing excavating and trenching, obviously, there's always a danger that you're going to come across some things that you don't know about. And also, how does hazardous waste, is it a known or unknown entity on these sites? Sometimes we do know for a fact that there is a hazardous waste or substance that could be on this site. And I'm going to share that with you in a few slides here about how we could possibly know that. But sometimes, despite due diligence and our best efforts to understand the site characterization, we don't know what's occurred on that land over the last 100 years, 150 years. I mean, the Industrial Revolution that's been occurring here in the United States, over the last couple hundred years, companies, they've come about. You don't know what they, polluted the earth with, the waters with. There's been a lot of high-profile cases throughout the years, things like Love Canal in upstate New York, Valley of the Drums in Kentucky. These were specifically about companies that, they just, gathered all this hazardous waste and substances. Sometimes they buried it. Sometimes they just kept it in containers and drums. And, over the years, these lands just became polluted. But these companies tend to be like locusts. They just pollute and then they move on. So, the United States government or the state or the local county is left with a giant mess on their hands. And again, sometimes they just don't know the magnitude of the pollutants that are in the land. So again, HAZWOPER, a very important program to address this. Now, the HAZWOPER program itself applies to 5 distinct groups of work operations. So if you are looking at any of these 5 within your company, chances are the HAZWOPER program is going to apply. So the first group of workers is anybody that's involved in cleanup operations whatsoever. So again, I talked to you earlier about companies that do specialize in work like this. And that's not to say that you can't have your own internal workforce that does cover some of this. If you've had the appropriate training to do this in-house, by all means, HAZWOPER is going to be a big part of that overall training. Corrective actions. Now, I mentioned a minute ago about lands that the U.S. government and states can definitely identify as being what they would call a Superfund site. There is something called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is known as RCRA of 1976. That was basically when Congress officially addressed laws that how to properly, store and dispose of waste. So after all these years and years and years of lands being polluted, Congress finally addressed exactly how companies are going to go about, handling their waste handling and treatment while, their normal day-to-day operations are going about. There was another act that came about called CERCLA, Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act of 1980. They identified approximately 1,300 Superfund sites where, in other words, the U.S. government definitely understands that these are polluted sites. I think to date, if memory serves, they've only addressed about 400 of these sites, just to show you, and demonstrate to you, just how large in scope these Superfund sites are. Out of 1,300, I believe to date, only 400 of these have been addressed. Voluntary cleanup operations at sites recognized by the federal government, that goes hand in hand with RCRA and Superfund. Operations involving hazardous waste that are conducted with treatment, storage, and disposal. I talked to you about that a minute ago, which are known as TSD sites. And any type of emergency response operation. So if you just happen to be working on a site where any sort of emergency response is going to be potentially required, or any discovery, release of hazardous substances, those are the 5 categories where HAZWOPER is going to apply. And again, it does not necessarily mean that you do know this for a fact. You could be a construction site that is, fully intending on, working in a certain operation that you have no intention of being around, hazardous substances and waste, but the mandate is you are going to have this training just in case. I gave you that example a minute ago where how, you've got a piece of construction equipment, digging in the ground, and suddenly they come across something that's just, nobody knew was there. So one of the things that we're going to learn as well about training, this training is pretty robust as well. So the requirement to have this training in place before you get to a job site, you're going to understand why it's so important to administer HAZWOPER training. Even if you're unsure about the training itself, it's always best to have it than not have it for lots of reasons. So when doesn't HAZWOPER apply? I get a lot of those questions as well. We know about when HAZWOPER could potentially apply. How about, how do I know for a fact it's not going to apply? Well, in general, how I would address that is if the hazardous substance or waste is going to be very minimal. If the accidental or unforeseeable release of a hazardous substance is very limited and very small, it doesn't pose any significant threat to safety and human health of workers and working in the immediate vicinity, that's when HAZWOPER typically is not going to apply. The program itself identifies that as an incidental release. So something that's very small in nature. And again, that is something that, is obviously going to be, investigated. We want our subject matter experts to look into this and say, hey, beyond a shadow of a doubt, we understand that there is a chemical or substance here that could be released, but it's so small in nature, it's just not going to apply. And, that's a very gray area as well. So in general, that's when HAZWOPER won't apply. So an example of that, a pint-sized bottle of xylene, cleaned up by workers at a site, something again that's very incidental, doesn't pose a very high risk of danger to humans. But on the opposite end of that spectrum, I showed you that picture earlier. If you suddenly have, a 1,000-gallon underground tank of hydrochloride, that's a completely different situation. Now, even in cases where you have small incidental releases of hazardous substances, waste, chemicals, there is another OSHA program called HAZCOM that does still apply. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But why I wanted to bring this about is HAZCOM and HAZWOPER are often confused with each other, and they're also interwoven with each other. One can definitely support the other. So I do want to point out that there is a differential between the two standards, two programs. But even in incidental release cases, you may not necessarily need HAZWOPER training, but HAZCOM training is going to apply under those circumstances. Before I talk to you a little bit about HAZCOM, I do want to address something as well. When we are talking about hazardous substances and waste and how they apply to HAZWOPER, another very common question that gets asked is, what specific hazardous substances and waste are we talking about? And there is a specific answer to that. And typically, waste and substances, as they are defined by the CERCLA Act, the Department of Transportation, and the Environmental Protection Agency. So there are documents here that I have laid forth for you for reference. All those regulatory references all relate back to specific hazardous waste and substances, and it is very, very extensive. A lot of my friends that are environmental, I should say industrial hygienists, this is what keeps them busy. So when you are talking about specific substances and specific wastes, this is where you're getting into the finer details about what harm these substances and waste can cause humans. What are the inhalation hazards? What are the contact hazards? What are the explosive natures of all these chemicals and waste and substances? So I just wanted to point that out. A lot of people do ask specifically how are all these waste and substances identified? Well, they're identified in specific circumstantial regulatory references with the EPA and Department of Transportation. Now, I mentioned HAZCOM to you a minute ago. Again, another OSHA program. One of the things I can tell you right off the bat, the reason why HAZWOPER, especially in the world of general industry, gets confused with HAZCOM, the HAZWOPER standard is identified in 1910.120. HAZCOM is identified in 1910.1200. So, just a matter of that one extra zero can create a lot of confusion for employers on the difference between HAZCOM and HAZWOPER. So HAZCOM, and it's also known as the Hazard Communication Standard, again, another OSHA specific program. This is how it applies to chemical safety in the workplace, even small amounts of chemicals in the workplace. The standard addresses both chemical manufacturers and importers. So anybody who is in the industry of actually manufacturing and creating certain chemicals, and people who import these chemicals into the United States. It also addresses the second big segment, which is all employers that have hazardous chemicals in their workplace. And this is where you get into finer details like how employees are going to identify certain chemicals, training on the use of labels and how they get affixed to things like drums and containers, safety data sheets, which is known as SDS. The old reference for that was a material safety data sheet, or MSDS. A lot of you may already be familiar with terms like this and familiar with the HAZCOM standard as well. And basically how it all associates to the safe handling of chemicals. A few years back, I believe it was 2012, OSHA updated their hazard communication standard to what's called GHS, the Globally Harmonized System. And that pictogram right there that you see is a GHS symbol. Basically, what it's all about is to make sure that all countries are on the same globally harmonized system of identification of chemicals and how these labels are fixed. So that was in the works for a long time with OSHA. So the globally harmonized system, GHS, is typically now built into the hazard communication standard. So I just wanted to address that, that differentiator between HAZWOPER and HAZCOM. Again, it's very, very common for employers to have to undergo training for their employees on both the HAZCOM standard and the HAZWOPER standard. But just know they are two separate programs when it comes to OSHA. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about training programs in general and how they apply to HAZWOPER. Okay, far and away, the most popular training program for HAZWOPER are their 24 and 40-hour general worker training programs. There are a lot more training programs that are associated with HAZWOPER, but in general, most people, most employees are going to have either had a 24 or 40-hour training program. Now, I mentioned to you a minute ago, a lot of employers sit on the fence about what, because they're just unsure about whether HAZWOPER training applies or not. This is not a 2 or 3 or 4-hour training program. At minimum, your employers are going to be looking at 24 hours worth of training. And as I just demonstrated a minute ago, how you could show up at a job site, on a Monday and be told that, hey, sorry, you folks need HAZWOPER training. And, again, you are going to be looking at a minimum of 24 hours. In some cases, you are going to be asked to mandate 40 hours of training. So it's not a good thing if you've got an entire crew of people show up on a job on Monday and be told that they cannot set foot on the site without 24 or 40 hours worth of training. Well, again, that's just not going to occur overnight. So whether you decide to undergo an online program or whether you have to go out and schedule an in-person training program, you're looking at 24 or 40 hours worth of training right off the bat. So again, it's just best to, again, even if you are unsure as to whether to get this training, I believe, in my experience, it's always best to implement this training for your employees rather than to not implement it. So let's talk a little bit about, what the specific requirements are for the general worksite. OSHA will identify in the HAZWOPER standard what they refer to as general site workers. And these can be any types of workers doing any type of work, whether it's on a construction site, whether it's in a manufacturing environment, operating machinery, operating equipment, general laborers. They can be doing any gamut of activity. And this is, and the highlight of this is where they know that they're engaged in hazardous substance removal or other activities which expose them to, or likely to expose them to, hazardous substances and health hazards. This is where really it's called out, whether it's called out in the contract, it's called out in the identification of the manufacturing environment or the work site, where they know that HAZWOPER is an issue. They know that their workers are going to be asked to do things like don respirators or, the permissible exposure limits. You're going to hear that a lot. It's called PEL. They just know that 40 hours worth of training is how it's going to apply. Then they call another group of workers limited workers or occasional workers. This is where workers who kind of come and go on the site. These can be things like specialists, chemists, people taking readings, even things like truck drivers going into a HAZWOPER identified site. They only may be on site for a couple of hours to unpack their load and deliver their equipment and their supplies. They are going to be required to have a certain amount of HAZWOPER training, and in most cases, it's going to be looking like 24 hours. And then the other category of general workers are managers and supervisors. HAZWOPER calls out that group a lot. Anybody who is in a management or supervisory role, they also have to have a HAZWOPER training, but they have to have a little more than just your general worker. So we'll get down to specifics here about what that's going to require. So when we talk about the general category of 24 or 40-hour training, the first thing we have to look at is what is the initial training requirement. Now, for those general workers who we absolutely know are going to be exposed, who are going to have to do things like don respirators and certain types of personal protective equipment, they are going to be engaged in things like handling of hazardous substances and toxins, and maybe even required to respond to things like immediate spills. They are going to be looking at 40 hours of instructional training. Now that instructional training, which I'll talk about in a minute, for the most part, in general, traditionally, it's been done in person, in a classroom environment. Now there are computer-based programs that they can take advantage of as well, but 40-hour training is going to be required initially. Now, this is another area of confusion for employers. The HAZWOPER training program will specifically say that after the initial 40 hours of instruction, an additional 3 days of field experience under the direction of a supervisor who is trained and experienced must occur as well. So the confusion comes in, why is that? Why, once somebody has undergone 40 hours worth of training, why do they need 3 days of actual field experience documented on that site? And I just want to point out that that 3 days of training, it's kind of a lesser training. It's not as formal as the first 40 hours. That 3 days of training sometimes is referred to as a site orientation. And there's actually a very good reason why OSHA requires this. When you undergo 40 hours of HAZWOPER training, what we're basically doing is we're orientating you on the standard itself, all the moving pieces of the HAZWOPER standard itself and all the training requirements. Once you get out to a specific site, you're talking about now specific information and hazards, how it applies to that work site. So in other words, during the 40 hours worth of training, you are certainly not going to receive instruction on every single last hazardous chemical and substance and waste as identified from the EPA and DOT requirements. But when you get out on that site, there may be specific chemicals that they absolutely know are out there, where now you need to know about the specific, design of those chemicals and how they are going to affect you. What are the permissible exposure limits to those chemicals? Where are they specifically located on the site? Who do you need to speak to specifically about this? What are the emergency response protocols? There's a whole other host of information that you need to know specifically about that work site. And what OSHA requires is that you are going to be orientated to that site for a minimum of 3 days, and that has to be documented. Again, it's not as formal as the first 40 hours, but you have to be orientated on the dangers and the protocols of that site by a trained supervisor. And I'm going to talk to you in a minute about the requirements for trainers and supervisors as well. That's another common question that comes about. For the limited worker, the occasional worker, again, 24 hours of initial training, we only have to undergo 1 day of field experience orientation. So 40 hours for the general worker with 3 days, 24 hours for the limited or occasional worker, and 1 day. And the other thing that I do want to point out, another question that comes about from employers, what happens if my employee has undergone 24 hours of training, but now suddenly their work site is changing to where they're going to require 40 hours? Well, OSHA does allow someone who has had 24 hours worth of initial training to obtain an additional 16 hours to bring themselves up to the 40 hours. And again, not only the additional 16 hours, but the additional field experience is going to have to be undergone on the site as well. The one thing I do want to point out is there is no such thing as 16 hours of initial training. A lot of folks think that they can get 16 hours of initial training and it's going to mean something. Well, it doesn't. 24 and 40 hours are the first and foremost trainings that are going to be required. If you've undergone 24 hours, you can certainly seek to obtain the next 16 hours of training to bring you up to 40. But the point is, it doesn't work in reverse. You can't implement 16 hours of HAZWOPER training knowing that somebody needs 24 hours and then put them out on the site. So that 16-hour program is strictly in place to bring the 24-hour worker up to the level of 40. So again, it does not work in reverse. Talked to you a minute ago about managers and supervisors. Managers and supervisors, for the most part, in the general working environment, are going to be required to have 40 hours of initial training and 3 days of field experience. However, they are also going to be required to obtain 8 additional hours beyond the 40. So that's another area of confusion. You know, if somebody is designated as a manager or supervisor, what else do they require? Well, in some cases, they are only going to be required to have 24 hours. I got to be honest with you, in all the years I've been doing this, most managers and supervisors are going to be mandated to have 40 hours. In very rare cases, they may be asked to have 24, but in most cases, it's 40. But just know, regardless of 24 or 40, supervisory training, 8 hours worth, is going to be required beyond that. So typically 40 hours plus 8 for any supervisor or manager. And all categories of HAZWOPER workers are going to be required to have 8 hours of annual refresher training beyond their initial training and beyond the manager and supervisor requirement. The manager supervisor requirement gets confused a lot with the annual refresher. A lot of people think that the annual refresher training and supervisor training kind of cancel out each other. They don't. Regardless whether you are a general worker or a manager supervisor, you have to keep your initial training current by taking 8 hours of annual refresher training. I also do want to point out that a lot of employers will ask, hey, you know, I didn't meet my annual refresher date when I was supposed to. You know, my annual refresher date was in January. I was so busy, I completely forgot about it. Now here we are in April. Do I have to go back and take my 24 or 40-hour training all over again? Or is there sort of a grace period? Believe it or not, and it's kind of strange that OSHA does allow this, but OSHA does allow a grace period of sorts for that 8-hour annual refresher training. They don't call it out specifically in terms of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. What they will basically say is they will leave it up to the employer to assess the individual to see if they have retained, you know, the knowledge that they need to know about this program, and then they'll leave it up to the employer to actually say yes or no to having them be able to take that 8 hours of annual refresher training. Now, folks, I will tell you by rule of thumb, you know, again, even though it's not spelled out, if I see anybody that's gone beyond maybe that 60 or 90-day window, maybe I will allow them to take the refresher training, maybe I won't. But certainly, if somebody comes up to me and they haven't taken their refresher training, you know, in 6 months or a year, I've got to be very careful because, you know, again, OSHA wants to make sure that you, the employer, and by the way, you know, that's the other thing. The only time OSHA is going to come into this picture is if something happens. And if something happens that the HAZWOPER training program and the HAZWOPER program you have for your employees, they're going to start pulling, you know, documentation, and they want to make sure that you've documented why you've allowed a whole batch of your employees that haven't had their refresher training in, you know, perhaps 6 months or a year, why you decided to just let them go ahead and take the refresher training as opposed to having them take the, you know, the 24 or 40-hour training program all over again. So you just got to be careful there. You got to make sure if you're making that decision, you're documenting your reasons why you made that decision. But I do just want to point out that, you know, if your employee does miss that annual initial window, you know, don't panic, you know, too much. If it's only been, you know, a matter of 30, 60, even 90 days, in most cases, they will be allowed to take that 8-hour refresher training program again. I talked a lot about the general category of workers. I do want to point out that the HAZWOPER standard also calls out a lot of different levels of HAZWOPER operation, okay? One of the biggest areas are anything in terms of emergency response personnel. This is where you are designating specific people within your organization to respond to emergencies, whether it's to respond to spills, cleanups, call in other emergency response providers, things of that nature. Things like incident commanders, first responders, you see how it's both an operations level and awareness level. Same thing applies to hazmat, hazardous materials technicians and specialists, and you look at the additional training that's going to be required for all these different levels of people involved in HAZWOPER operations and emergency response. It also comes down to a RECRA TSD operations personnel for 24 hours and also the annual requirement there. Without getting too overwhelming here about all these different levels of training requirements, just I guess the big takeaway here I'll ask for is just know that because you've done 40 or 24 hours of general training in HAZWOPER, it certainly in no way, shape, or form qualifies anybody to be an incident commander, a first responder, any sort of emergency response, position. Just because they've had 24 or 40 hours, it does not mean that they are instantly going to be, qualified to do any of these other operations. And by the way, some employers will create an in-house program that addresses all these different types of positions, and sometimes your program can incorporate third-party companies that actually specialize in these areas. Now, HAZWOPER training topics. One thing I want to talk about before I get into the actual sample areas of a HAZWOPER training program. Another big question that comes up is who can actually train on these topics? Who specifically is qualified to train in HAZWOPER? Now, this is where I hear the word certified a lot come up, and that word does not apply. You got to be very careful when you're talking about certified and and OSHA, and specifically with things like HAZWOPER. A lot of companies specifically say, Paul, can I create my own HAZWOPER training program and use my own people to do it? Yes, the short answer is yes, you certainly can. However, OSHA calls out right in their HAZWOPER standard that the trainers must be qualified. And they don't just need to be qualified in the subject matter. They don't just need to be qualified in, the HAZWOPER standard, their experience, their academic credential, things of that nature. They also have to be qualified in instructional skills. And this has been something that's been gaining in popularity, and this has been under OSHA's watchful eye over the last few years. If you're going to identify anybody within your organization as a trainer, it's not just applicable to the subject matter that they know or their experience or their credentials. OSHA also wants to know what skills and experience does that person have as an actual trainer. Do they understand how to train adults? Do they understand how to design and develop and deliver training programs? So the point I'm trying to make here, folks, you've got to be very, very careful who you are going to identify as a trainer within your organization. It does not mean that you cannot take somebody that understands the HAZWOPER training program and then send them out to get some additional training on instructional skills. But again, once more, trainers, they've got to be qualified in accordance with the HAZWOPER training program. Sometimes this is why employers just basically seek to go outside and hire companies that do this. Hire HAZWOPER specific companies that have qualified trainers, things of that nature. But if you are certainly interested in building a HAZWOPER program, there's nothing saying that you can't appoint certain people within your organization that may already have a very solid base of educational, academic, experience and training, and then just build upon that. But bottom line, just be very careful on who you're calling a HAZWOPER trainer. Some of the topics that you see that are part of HAZWOPER training. Now, I've talked to you about what the standard addresses. When you start specifically talking about HAZWOPER training, and there is, within the HAZWOPER standard, there is something called Appendix E. And Appendix E talks all about the training requirements, training curriculum guidelines. So in other words, If you were going to build your own training program as it applies to the HAZWOPER requirements, you can certainly do that. You just have to make sure that you reference subpart E, Appendix E, and there are certain components of the training that have to be implemented. And these are just some of them. Safety and health programs, site control, characterization, and analysis. Personal protective equipment is a huge part of that training curriculum. Things like respirators and personal protective clothing that your employees are going to have to don and wear and understand its use and limitations and maintenance factors. Things like medical surveillance, you can read the list there. There's all types of things there. Permissible exposure limits. These are things where, how long can I actually be exposed to a certain hazardous substance, chemical, things of that nature. And, emergency response guidelines. The reason why I highlighted personal protective equipment, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit more here in the next slide or two, there are certain elements of the training program that just don't require a classroom instruction on. You actually have to have a hands-on component as part of that. So in other words, if I was sitting down a classroom of students, and part of my training program is going to talk about respirators, like what you see that person donning there, I can't just do a quick demonstration on the components of the respirator itself. I actually have to make sure that these students understand how to properly don that equipment and, fit test that equipment. What are the limitations of that equipment? There's got to be a hands-on portion required within that training element. And the reason why this is very important to point out is a lot of online and computer-based programs have no way of doing that. They can certainly supplement the online program with a little classroom instruction if they have a qualified trainer to do that. But there is only one product that I know about right now that actually has a function that does meet that hands-on requirement that OSHA calls out. And I will talk to you about that in a minute. When we talk about HAZWOPER itself, I want to point out that training is only one element of the HAZWOPER program. You cannot just conduct HAZWOPER training and call it done. You actually have to have a documented HAZWOPER program. And some of the things that program must address are things like hazard recognition and control, PPE selection, medical evaluation and testing, environmental sampling, documentation and record keeping, things like medical records, elements like that. Anytime you're talking about designing a program, especially when it comes to training, there's something called the ADDIE principle, ADDIE. It stands for Assessment, Design, Development, Implementation, and Evaluation. So a lot of things when I look for, when I go out and I visit employers and I try to evaluate their programs, if I ask an employer, tell me when the last time is you evaluated your HAZWOPER training program, and I think everybody on the line understands where I'm going with this. You may still be training on PowerPoint presentations that are, 10, 15 years old. It's just the way you've been doing things, and you haven't bothered to go back to see if these programs are up to date with the most current HAZWOPER standard. You may be training on things that are completely out of date and, and antiquated. So it's one thing to say you do training, but if you can't show me that you've gone back and routinely evaluated that program, now I've got to ask what the actual value of that training program really is. If you haven't looked into training requirements for your trainers and what those requirements are going to be, routinely, again, now I have to question the abilities of the trainer itself. So it's very, very important to not just develop a program. You've also got to understand how to assess the program, how to assess the needs of your workforce and how it applies to the hazards they're going to be working around, but also how you're going to design and develop this program and how you are going to go about implementing that program. And again, the other big part of that is how you are going to evaluate that program. So again, just doing the training is not enough. It falls far short of having an effective HAZWOPER program. And a common question I get with this is, can we actually go about this ourselves? Folks, I'm not going to kid you. whenever you're talking about designing a HAZWOPER program, if you do not have in-house credentialed expertise, it is always best to seek outside assistance with this. And there's a lot of ways you can do it. You can go to OSHA itself. They've got, co-op programs that you can take advantage of. You can also seek the advice of a professional certified, company or individual that can help you with consulting assistance. So be very careful. This is definitely not a program you just kind of, want to wing it. You want to make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's and doing due diligence as to what you need to do with your program. So I'm going to finish up my presentation. I've got one eye on the clock here. I think I'm going to finish up here in about 5 minutes. I want to talk to you a little bit about training delivery. I spoke to you that traditionally HAZWOPER training has been delivered in an instructor-led classroom environment. There are lots of companies that do this for a living, that they come to you or you can go to their training facility and get your 24 or 40-hour program delivered. Even some of the specialized programs on hazmat and RECRA, TSD, things of that nature. Of course, we live in the world of technology now. A lot of companies implement online and computer-based training programs. They are very popular. They are, there's a whole gamut of training programs out there available on, fall protection, confined space, electrical hazards, scaffolds, you name it. All the things that, can get you injured, all the things that can get you ill and sick. There's a variety of content abundant out there that employers can choose from. But what I did tell you a little while ago is that OSHA over the years has scrutinized online and computer-based training specifically for HAZWOPER training because of the limitations that online and computer-based training has when it comes to hands-on requirements for certain topics. Folks, I will tell you that the only online computer-based product that I do know of that has been, quote unquote, accepted by OSHA to meet this hands-on requirement is the NET product from National Environmental Trainers. I have, at this third bullet, I have put a link in there. Back in 2009, the NET founders developed what they call their patented simulator. It is actually a technology-based online simulator that it is part of all their HAZWOPER training programs, where it actually mimics and it demonstrates how someone can actually don a piece of equipment. It's a really nifty piece of technology. Well, basically, they went back and forth with OSHA on this, and OSHA sampled it. And, in very uncharacteristic fashion, OSHA back in 2009 came out with a letter of interpretation that they did accept this technology as meeting that hands-on component of HAZWOPER training. So please, by all means, download that, access that hot link. You could read the letter of interpretation for yourself, but just know that and I'm telling you, as far as I know of, that is the only online product that I know of that does have that. Certainly somebody may have, very recently developed something similar, but that is the only one I currently know of. And folks, I'd like to finish off my presentation, again, not to be giving a plug to any specific, training product, but being that this webinar is being brought to you by TCP and NET, I'd like to point out that they have a very, very, good quality product here in the NET HAZWOPER training programs. Very good graphics and video, very good content. It is very well recognized in the industry. Their current library consists of 25 HAZWOPER training programs that are available in English and some in Spanish. And I have left the link for you to National Environmental Trainers for all the courses that they offer. It is very, very detailed. It shows the breakdown of the curriculum. It shows the prerequisites that you will require for the training itself. Obviously, pricing structure, things of that. So, I'll just put it out there. If NET can be of any assistance to you whatsoever in providing HAZWOPER training to your workforce, please give them a look. And the last thing I will highlight is the OSHA HAZWOPER Safety and Health topic page. That link goes directly to the HAZWOPER training program. So typically, any questions that you have regarding training, structure of an effective program, a lot of the FAQs that are documented by OSHA, a lot of letters of interpretation that have come about from employers asking OSHA over the last 40, 45 years. It's all in that website. It's chock full of information, can answer a lot of great questions for you. So please, by all means, take a good look at that website. And with that, I got about 5 minutes here left, and John, I believe that you are going to take a look to see if there's any questions. I will be more than happy to address it if I know the answer. And by all means, if you leave your contact information for John, if there's anything that I cannot get to or I can't answer, I will be happy to research that question and contact you directly with an answer. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, John.
All right, thanks, Paul. Yeah, there's a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. If you have a question, just click open that box and type in your question. Again, I know some folks joined us late, so I'll repeat myself in saying that if you do need a copy of the presentation, we are more than happy to get that for you. You'll receive a request for a survey and a follow-up email after this webinar. Just respond back to that email, come straight to me, and just let me know that you would like, a copy of the presentation or a link to the video when we put it up online. So that way, if you missed anything or you want to go back to anything, you can certainly do that at your own leisure. Still waiting for some questions to filter in. Paul, do you have any parting thoughts while we sort of wait for those to come in?
Well, yeah, sure. Again, John, I think that HAZWOPER being a very robust program, it certainly can be very overwhelming when people are trying to figure out, if the program applies to them, what sort of training that their workforce is going to be looking at and requiring. So again, hopefully I've kind of cleared the air somewhat during this presentation, but again, it just happens to be one of those OSHA standards and regulatory programs that can be very confusing. And, again, I would definitely recommend that, don't try to figure this out on your own. Certainly go to people that speak this language and, and understand that program because you don't want to take chances on guessing.
All right. Paul, do you ever find that people, companies, facilities are in fact working with hazardous waste and chemicals and substances, and yet maybe they don't know about it? Are there any things out there that OSHA considers to be a hazardous waste, but for a normal facility just may get overlooked as such? Is there anything like that that you can think of?
John, that's a great question, and I will add to that. Certainly there are clients out there, there are employers out there that are just not aware. I said that, especially on the small and medium-sized employer end that don't have resources, they don't have dedicated safety and health professionals. Yeah, many of them just may be under the assumption that everything is fine, or they just don't know. I'm sorry to say this, but there are certain, I'm sure there are employers out there that are aware of that they may need certain things, put in place, and for whatever reason, they're just not doing them. One thing I do want to point out that I didn't cover in the presentation, I'm glad I'm addressing this now. OSHA will also accept what they call equivalent training. And equivalent HAZWOPER training can be something similar to it. And I see this happen a lot. Employees for companies, they may be current or ex-firefighters. And those firefighters have received things like hazardous material training, emergency response training. They may have very robust training that they've had in the past. And OSHA will certainly look at that type of training, and you, the employer, need to look at that training and say, maybe this training does meet the HAZWOPER requirement to where that individual won't need HAZWOPER training. But to your point, John, I think a lot of people come from a lot of different backgrounds, industrial hygienists and chemists and emergency response technicians. And sometimes the employer is just under the assumption that those employees have had that type of experience and training. And because of that, they're good. They just, feel like they can ignore the HAZWOPER requirement. So, again, it's just one of those situations where don't leave it up to assumption. Take a good hard look into what you're going to be required to do. And if HAZWOPER does apply, certainly put those elements in place that you need to address.
All right, thanks so much, Paul. No other questions have come in, so you must have covered everything. So with that, I think we will end today's program. I do want to thank you guys on behalf of Paul, myself, TPC Training, National Environmental Trainers. Thank you so very much for joining us. Again, if you need anything from us, please respond to the follow-up emails that you get, and we will be more than happy to help you out, answer any questions that may crop up in the future. With that, thanks very much. Have a great day.